A rancher saved a native princess. Next day, her tribe came with a strange offer. The wind that rolled over the plains that evening was dry, scented faintly with dust and ash, what some might call the smell of endings. It was late summer, 1878, on the cusp of autumn. Elias Boone rode that land like a man tethered to nothing. He didn't know yet what he was riding toward. Elias knew how to read signs: boot tracks too close to his gait, blood on a saddle blanket, the way certain birds flew low when something unnatural stirred. He trusted silence the way others trusted sermons. So when the wind changed that evening, just a sliver, he noticed. It wasn't much. A shift in scent, a tension in the air, like heat rising from a road that shouldn't be warm. His mare flicked her ears but didn't startle. Elias touched the rifle at his side, not to draw it, just to know it was there. Something was wrong. The trail bent east toward a dry creek bed, where cottonwoods clung to the banks like stubborn old men refusing to leave their posts. Elias guided Dulcie down the slope, her hooves kicking up brittle dust that drifted like ash. He wasn't looking for anything, not really. Maybe water. Maybe the sort of quiet that came after a hard day, when even your bones seemed to exhale. Then he saw her. At first, it was just the shape, something too still, too wrong against the silvered scrub. A post, rope, bare feet in the dust. And then, clearer, a woman, tied with her arms above her head, her long dark hair tangled with sweat and earth. Her cheeks were mottled with the dusky bloom of bruises, and there was a split on her bottom lip, the blood dried to rust. Can you guess what's about to happen? Leave your prediction in the comments. Like the video to motivate me to make the next videos. The ride home was long and silent, broken only by the wind dragging across the plain like an old hymn half forgotten. Elias kept his eyes forward, one hand loosely on the reins, the other resting near his rifle, more out of habit than threat. The woman, Tahuya, though her name had not yet passed between them, sat behind him, not holding on, not shifting her weight. She rode like someone who had learned long ago not to brace for impact. Or maybe someone who decided it didn't matter anymore. She never spoke. Not when they crossed the shallow creek bed with its whispering stones. Not when coyotes called in the distance like ghostly echoes of a forgotten war. Her silence was not the frightened kind. It was older, worn smooth like river rock. The silence of someone who had learned the danger of asking. Elias had brought back strays before, injured horses, a dog with a broken paw, once even a child whose wagon had flipped. But this was different. There was no plan here, no duty, just a knowing, deep in the part of him that still listened to things with no voice. The wind, the weight of a stare, the absence of begging. When they reached the gate to his ranch, Elias dismounted first. He offered a hand to help her down, not as command, not even courtesy, but as an open door. She didn't take it. Instead, she slid off the saddle on her own, landing awkwardly but not falling. Her knees trembled beneath her, bare feet pale against the dirt, but she straightened with a quiet defiance that didn't ask to be witnessed. Elias didn't press. He simply nodded and walked ahead, pushing open the old creaking gate that had kept out coyotes better than men. She followed, her steps soundless behind him, like shadow or memory. The cabin was simple, a single room, wood-planked floor, stone hearth, and the faint scent of pine smoke clinging to old quilts and cedar shelves. A cot stood near the fire, made up that morning out of habit, not hope. Elias gestured toward it, then poured water into a tin basin and set it beside a folded towel. She looked at it, then at him, expression unreadable. He didn't explain. Instead, he busied himself at the stove, adding kindling, coaxing flame, setting the black kettle to boil. The rituals of the alone. He didn't ask her name. He didn't ask where she came from. There were stories a man had to earn the right to hear, and Elias Boone had not yet earned anything but her silence. She moved slowly, every step a negotiation between will and pain. When she reached the cot, she didn't sit right away, just stood beside it, examining the fabric, the stitching, the space itself, like a caged animal assessing whether the bars were visible or just imagined. Elias poured a tin cup of water and set it on the stool beside her cot. Then he pulled a blanket, an old one, faded blue, his mother's hand somewhere still in the seams, and offered it without a word. She took it, not as a gift, not as surrender, but the way one accepts the shift in weather, something inevitable, neither cruel nor kind. He returned to the hearth, sat in the chair facing the fire, and picked up the cloth he'd been oiling his rifle with earlier that morning. It was an old habit, clean something when the silence felt too close to break. But tonight, the cloth barely moved. His hands were still. Behind him, the cot creaked once, then settled. No words, no thank you. The only sound was the sigh of logs shifting in the hearth and the low hum of water just beginning to boil. She didn't sleep. He could feel it, even without looking. She lay there, body curled toward the wall, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders, eyes open in the dark. People thought stillness meant peace, but Elias knew better. Some silences were louder than thunder. He didn't try to make her comfortable, didn't offer bread, didn't press questions. There were things she would take if she needed them, and if she didn't, he wouldn't shame her by insisting. Outside, the wind picked up again, brushing against the eaves like the land exhaling. Elias stared into the fire until the flames blurred. His thoughts weren't sharp, just drifting, low and slow, like storm clouds waiting for a reason to fall. He didn't know what to make of her, not yet. Only that she hadn't begged, hadn't wept, hadn't made herself smaller to fit anyone's mercy, and that, somehow, mattered. When the kettle hissed its warning, he rose, poured the hot water into a second basin, and placed it near the door. Not for tea, for washing. A gesture, nothing more. She didn't move. He turned down the lamp, left only the fire's glow, and lay back on the narrow bench against the opposite wall. He didn't undress, didn't close his eyes right away, just listened. To the fire, to the wind, to the presence of another soul learning how to breathe again. And for the first time in years, Elias Boone did not feel entirely alone. By dawn, she was standing barefoot near the corral, her hair loose, wind-stirred, catching the pale morning light like strands of ink. Elias watched her from the porch, a cup of black coffee in hand, not making a sound. There was something about how she stood, chin lifted, eyes steady, that told him this was not her first morning after captivity. She'd survived worse. He could feel it. She reached out to touch the mare, Dulcie, running gentle fingers along the velvet-soft muzzle. The horse, usually wary of strangers, leaned into the touch like she remembered something too. "She knows Comanche," the woman said softly. Elias blinked. Her voice was unexpected, dry, wind-worn, but certain. It was the first sound she'd made beyond breath and movement. "You speak English?" he said, more observation than question. She nodded once, eyes still on the horse. "My mother taught me, before she died." He stepped down from the porch, but kept his distance. There was no need to crowd silence when it had finally offered a gift. "I'm Elias Boone," he said. She didn't answer, not with a name, just gave a slow nod, as if tucking the fact of his name somewhere she could find it later. That day she swept the porch without being asked, folded the blanket he'd given her, and left the bread untouched again. But when Elias stepped outside to mend the fence line, he returned to find the coffee he'd left beside her cot had been drunk. It was a rhythm forming, not conversation, not ritual, just survival polished into small mutual acts. She didn't ask to be trusted, and he didn't ask to be understood. Yet something in the air between them softened. Late that evening, as dusk fell across the fields and the first stars blinked on like eyes half closed in prayer, she sat by the hearth and took up a shirt from the laundry pile, a tear at the shoulder near the seam. She threaded a needle with surprising deftness and began to stitch. Elias didn't stop her. He didn't speak. He just sat nearby, close enough to hear the whisper of thread through cloth, and tried not to notice the way her fingers moved. Quick, sure, unafraid. They stayed like that, firelight dancing against wood and quiet skin, until she paused and looked up. Her eyes flicked toward him, then to the collar of his shirt where a jagged scar peeked above the fabric. She reached out, not abruptly, not invasively, but with the kind of stillness that asks permission without speaking. Her fingertip touched the edge of the scar.
"They did that?" she asked, voice low. "No," he said, "different war." She nodded, the faintest tilt of her chin, then returned to her stitching. No apology, no questions, just understanding. That night, after the fire had burned low and the fields outside disappeared into darkness, Elias didn't sleep right away. He sat on the porch again, boots planted wide, hands clasped loosely between his knees. Somewhere out in the hills a coyote cried, one long note, rising like a sorrow that didn't know where else to go. Inside, he heard the soft shift of fabric, the sound of bare feet crossing the wooden floor. Then silence again. She appeared at the doorway, not stepping outside, just standing there, haloed by warm light and shadow. Her eyes searched the land, the way one searches the sea for a ship they're not sure will return. "I am Tahuya," she said at last. Elias didn't move, just listened. "Daughter of Satanta." That name, Satanta, landed like a dropped iron on his chest. Not fear, not awe, just the heavy weight of recognition. Satanta, the Comanche war chief who had led raids across the southern plains for over a decade. A name that lived in both prayer and threat, depending on which side of the river you came from. Elias turned to look at her fully now, but not as if seeing a stranger. He nodded, slow and thoughtful, like a man realizing he'd just lit a match in dry brush. "You are Comanche," he said quietly. She didn't flinch. "I was taken by scouts, Kaya mercenaries, sold to that man, Varner." There was no tremble in her voice, no plea for pity, just facts, spoken like stones laid in a path. "You were a war prize," Elias said, almost to himself. Tahuya's expression didn't change, but her voice sharpened, just slightly. "I am not a prize." He nodded again, this time more quickly. "Didn't mean it that way." She stepped back from the doorway, her shadow shrinking into the room behind her. "Then don't say it again." And then she was gone, back into the dim cabin, back into a silence she had chosen, not one forced upon her. Elias remained on the porch long after that. The coyote had gone quiet. The stars blinked steadily above, like a promise no one dared claim. He didn't feel threatened, not exactly, but something had shifted. He had not just brought a woman into his home. He had sheltered the daughter of one of the most feared war leaders in the territory, and whether anyone knew yet or would ever come, he understood in his bones what it meant. She was not just someone's daughter, she was a living oath, a line that could not be crossed without consequence. But Elias Boone had already crossed it, not with his hands, with his choice to stay. The next morning, Elias awoke to the smell of coffee already brewed. He sat up slowly, blinking into the soft amber light of dawn, filtering through the cabin slats. On the stool near the hearth, the kettle still steamed, and beside it 2 tin mugs sat, one full, one half empty. She had made it, and she had taken some. Not while he watched, but after he'd fallen asleep. It was a line crossed, gently.
He found her out by the coop, oiling the hinges of the gate with one of his rags. She hadn't asked, just saw the rust, the squeak, and fixed it. Her sleeves were rolled up, hair tied back with a strip of torn cloth. She didn't glance at him as he approached, but she didn't walk away either. "You always fix what doesn't belong to you?" he asked. She wiped her hands on her skirt and said, "You gave me water."
"I give you silence that doesn't rot wood." He chuckled once, short and honest. It was the first time he'd smiled in years. That day she stayed close to the ranch, not out of fear, but because it seemed to be what she chose. She swept the porch again, restacked the firewood by height, not just size, mended another tear in his coat without a word. Each gesture, small, deliberate, without apology or permission. Elias noticed the way she paused before touching anything, a hesitation born not of timidity but of memory. She had learned to ask the air for approval because men had not given it freely. So he gave space instead. They didn't eat together. She waited until he stepped out to check the horses, then took a bit of bread or beans. Sometimes only water. But she always folded the blanket back after sleeping, set the mug upside down after drinking. Her presence became like the scent of rain in the distance, barely there, but promising something healing. That evening, Elias sat sharpening his knife on the porch stone. She came out quietly, hands empty, gaze lifted toward the sky. "In Comanche," she said, "the moon is called guiding sister. When it's full, women see clearly." He didn't look at the moon. He looked at her. "You seein' clearly?" She didn't answer, just sat beside him on the porch step, not touching, not facing him, only sharing the same length of dusk. Her body held tension still, but her shoulders dropped a fraction, as if the weight of being watched had lessened. They stayed like that until the stars thickened. No more words passed. But something had been built, neither bridge nor wall, something better. A quiet place where no one had to ask for permission to stay. The days turned without name. Not in the way that time drifts for the idle, but in the way two people live beside one another without needing to mark every hour. Tahuya began tending the chickens. She didn't ask how. She simply watched Elias once, then did it better. She learned his routines, when he watered the orchard, how he cleaned the tack, where he stored nails by size, and mirrored them without fuss. Once, when he bent to lift a broken gate, arms full of tools and boards, she stepped in without a word and handed him the nails before he could ask. Their hands brushed. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. She didn't smile, but something in her posture softened. One afternoon, while Elias was repairing the rain barrel, he noticed her by the orchard, crouched in the grass, her back to him. Curious, he approached slowly. In her hands, cupped gently, was a baby bird, feathers still damp from the nest, one wing twisted at an angle that meant flight would never come. "It fell," she whispered. "Its wing is broken." Elias crouched beside her. "Can't fix that." Tahuya nodded. "Still, we try. We try for small things." She held the bird to her chest a moment longer, then nestled it in a rag-lined box and set it near the stove. That night, as the wind howled outside and the cabin filled with warm firelight, Elias found himself listening, not to the storm, but to the rhythm of her breath beside it. Not quite peace, but presence. She sat in the corner near the fire, humming softly. A tune he didn't recognize, something river-bound, older than English, older than sorrow. He watched her from his chair, not like a man studying a puzzle, but like someone who'd remembered the shape of gratitude. He didn't reach for her, didn't ask for her story again. But when she looked up and met his gaze across the room, he didn't look away either. And for the first time since she arrived, the silence between them didn't feel like defense. It felt like home. It was on the 6th morning that the sky changed.
Elias noticed it first in the stillness, not the peaceful kind, but the kind that comes before a land splits open. The birds had gone quiet. Even the wind, which never ceased on this stretch of earth, seemed to hush. He was splitting fence rails behind the barn when he saw it, a single column of smoke rising far to the east, straight and thin, too disciplined to be a cooking fire. It stood like a spine against the sky, intentional, measured, a signal. He wiped his hands on his trousers, his heart not quickening but tightening. He knew what it meant. Smoke that straight didn't come from wanderers or drunkards. It came from warriors, from someone letting you know they'd found what they were looking for. Inside, Tahuya stood near the window, arms crossed. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. "They found me," she said quietly. Elias didn't respond at first. He walked to the porch, picked up the rifle he kept there more from habit than hope, and checked the chamber. Loaded, clean, ready. "They'll come before dusk," she added, stepping outside beside him. He looked at her then, not with fear, but with something older, the kind of gaze a man gives a woman he won't claim, but would still bleed for. "You want to leave before they arrive?" Tahuya shook her head. "No," she said, "I won't run again." Elias nodded once. It wasn't approval, it was understanding. Together they sat on the porch. She poured 2 cups of coffee, handed him one like it was a ritual. Neither spoke of plans or defense. There was nothing to plan. Either the past would come to punish, or it would come to witness. By late afternoon, the dust rose on the horizon, low at first, then thickening like smoke over dry leaves. 20 riders appeared, silent as stone, their faces marked with red and white war paint, feathers braided into hair that had never known scissors. No war cries, no drums, just silence so deep the chickens fled into the coop and the dog refused to bark. Tahuya stood straight beside Elias. She didn't tremble. The lead rider dismounted with the ease of someone who had ridden across lifetimes. He was tall, silver-haired, his face carved by wind and grief. Satanta. He looked first at his daughter, then at the man beside her. "You returned my blood," Satanta said in English that was rough but unmistakable. Elias didn't blink. "I didn't take her. You kept her safe. I did what I could." "I owe you," the chief said. "You don't." Elias's voice was steady, not defiant, just honest. Satanta studied him the way a man might examine a blade before deciding whether it could be sheathed or must be buried. "There is one thing I will offer," he said at last. Elias didn't move. "Take her, as your wife. You may join our blood." Behind him, not a single warrior shifted. Tahuya didn't flinch. Elias turned toward her, not answering. "Is this what you want?" She held his gaze. "I want to decide, not be traded again." Satanta nodded. "She chooses." And that, more than any smoke or silence, was the truest sign of who they were. The stillness lingered after Satanta spoke. Around them, the riders remained mounted, unmoving. Their silence wasn't passive, it was ceremonial. They were not there to fight, not unless insult was given. But the weight of tradition hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear. Elias stood with both hands open at his sides. He had not holstered his rifle. He had not raised it either. The choice, as it had been from the start, belonged to her. He looked at Tahuya. "If you want to go," he said softly, "I won't stand in your way." "I know," she replied. There was no fear in her voice, no emotion at all, only clarity. That made it heavier than shouting. Satanta took one slow step forward, just far enough to close the space between their groups, but not enough to cross the threshold of the ranch. He respected borders. That, too, was a message. "You have protected what is sacred," he told Elias, "and you have not touched what is not yours." Elias didn't reply. Some things didn't require a thank you. Satanta turned back to his daughter. "You have a place with us. You will never be dishonored." Tahuya tilted her head slightly. "And if I stay?" The chief paused. "Then stay whole," he said, "but not as shadow, not as secret." Elias heard it.
She would not be kept like an object, not even under the guise of protection. If she stayed, she must be honored, seen, free. He nodded slowly. "She's not hidden here. She never was." Satanta glanced once more between them. "Then she decides." Tahuya stepped forward then, past Elias, past the porch, until she stood midway between the man who had given her life and the man who had refused to take it. She stood tall, hands loose at her sides, her back straight beneath the sky. "I will stay," she said, "but not as his wife, not yet." There was no rebellion in her tone, no resentment, just truth, like water finding its own level. Satanta neither frowned nor smiled. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes softened. "Why not?" "Because I don't know who I am," she answered. "Not without chains, not without tribe. I need to find that first." The words fell into the silence like seeds, and the land, as always, listened. Satanta gave a slow nod. "You are blood, but you are woman now, so choose." And with that, he stepped back, raising one hand, not in farewell, but in respect. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode off. The warriors followed in silence, their presence fading like mist at dawn. No dust, no threat, only a space where choice had been granted and honored. Elias exhaled only when they disappeared over the ridge. He looked at Tahuya, unsure if relief was the right word for what he felt. "You didn't have to stay," he said. "I know," she replied. She walked past him, into the house, not as a guest or a secret, but as someone who had chosen where she would begin again. That night, Elias didn't sleep. Not because of fear, they were safe for now, but because the silence in his chest had shifted. It was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence before a reckoning. He sat at the kitchen table long after the fire had gone low, the oil lamp casting long shadows across the walls. His hands were stained from work, calloused and cracked. He turned them palm up and stared. Once, these hands had held a girl's waist as they danced in the moonlight behind a Baptist barn. She had been Comanche too, laughed with her whole body, trusted too easily. He remembered the day they hanged her. Uniforms, orders barked in English, and the rope that bit into her neck before he could even speak her name. He hadn't touched another woman since. The shame didn't come from desire, it came from survival. He had lived, and she hadn't. He had buried his rage beneath planks of wood and jars of nails, trying to forget the sound of her feet kicking air. Now here was Tahuya. She hadn't asked him for protection. She hadn't offered forgiveness. She had simply stayed. And in doing so, she'd stirred something he thought long dead. Not lust, not even comfort, but the idea that maybe a man could still be seen as more than what he had failed to save. When she came out from the back room, barefoot, eyes sleepy but watchful, she didn't speak, just saw him sitting there, jaw clenched around a memory. She crossed the room in silence, paused beside him, then reached for his hand, not to hold, but to steady. "You're carrying too much," she said simply. Then, like it was nothing at all, she took the rag from the table and began cleaning the dirt from his palms. She worked slowly, wiping the grit from each finger, her touch neither soft nor clinical, just present. It was the first time anyone had touched Elias Boone without flinching or needing something in return. He didn't speak, didn't pull away,
Didn't dare. Because this wasn't forgiveness. It was recognition. He had not rescued her. He had not earned her loyalty. But in this moment, she saw him, not as the man who survived while others didn't, not as a rancher or soldier or ghost, but as someone who had stayed. And sometimes that was enough. When she finished, she folded the rag, placed it beside his hand, and looked at him. No questions, no permission sought, just an offering. Let me carry what you don't have to hold alone anymore. He couldn't say thank you. The words felt too thin for something so wide. So instead, he nodded once and let the silence settle between them, not as barrier, but bond. The next morning, they worked the fence line together, side by side. No roles, no titles, just two people who had survived different wars, building something new with wood, wire, and the quiet rhythm of shared breath. And though no vows were spoken and no names were exchanged in prayer, something had shifted. They were no longer two strangers sharing space. They were two stories, stitched together, not by fate, but by choice. How are you feeling witnessing this scene? Like video and let us know your emotions in the comments below.
She was gone by morning. The shawl Elias's mother had once worn was folded neatly on the cot. The fire was cold. Her moccasins, always left by the hearth, were missing. No note, no noise, just absence, total and clean, like a page turned with no warning. Elias didn't curse, didn't slam a door or ride out in fury. He stood in the center of the cabin, letting the stillness wrap around him like a coat he used to wear before he remembered what warmth felt like. Then he saddled Dulcie. There were no boot tracks, but Elias had spent years tracking men who didn't want to be found. He noticed where a leaf had been bent the wrong way, where dust had settled over one print lighter than another. She hadn't rushed. She hadn't hidden. She had walked straight out, like she had somewhere to go and meant to get there. He followed. It took the better part of a day. Over 2 ridges, past a creek gone dry, through a line of birch that whispered like paper ghosts. And then ashes from a small fire, still warm. The kind of camp only someone raised by warriors could make, invisible until you nearly stepped on it. And beyond that, the rise. Tahuya stood on the edge of a hill, just within sight of another cluster of horses, figures around a central fire. Her tribe, or what was left of it. She didn't turn when she heard him behind her, just spoke. I had to say goodbye. Elias didn't ask questions, didn't demand an explanation. He stepped forward, stopping a few paces behind her, letting the wind carry his voice instead of force. You headed back for good? She shook her head slowly. No, I'm not going back. Just letting go. A pause. For a long time, she said, everything that happened to me felt like someone else decided. The chains, the silence, even being safe. Her voice cracked slightly, but she steadied it. I needed to look them in the face, the people who gave me a name, the ones who watched it be taken. He nodded once. Makes sense. She turned to him then. There were no tears in her eyes, but there was a softness, a clarity that hadn't been there the night she first sat at his fire. I didn't leave because I doubted you, she said. I left because I needed to stop doubting myself. He took a breath, then let it go slow. So now what? She looked at him, the corners of her mouth lifting, just slightly. Now I choose. I want morning coffee, a quiet porch, and someone who watches me, without owning me.
Elias didn't smile, but his shoulders eased. He opened his hand, palm up. She stepped forward and laid hers in it. And just like that, they walked back toward the horizon together. Not as rescuer and rescued, not as captor and captive, but as two people who had finally unchained themselves. The porch became their sanctuary, not by declaration, but by rhythm. Each morning, Elias would grind the beans slow and careful, the way his mother once did. He poured the coffee into the tin mugs and set one on the step beside where Tahuya always sat, back straight, eyes already on the horizon. She never asked for sugar. She never stirred the cup. Just drank it black, hot, and in silence. Some days they didn't speak until noon. Other days she would hum something old, fragments of songs from riverbanks and red dirt, melodies that had no words but carried weight all the same. She didn't move into his room, didn't wear a ring, but her blanket stayed folded by the hearth. Her moccasins always lined up beside his boots. And on the fence post she hung feathers that swayed with the wind, not as a warning, but as a whisper to passing spirits. She was not lost anymore. They worked side by side without needing to explain tasks. Elias fixed the hinge on the barn door. Tahuya sorted seed from the old tobacco sacks. When she found a broken tool, she didn't ask him to fix it. She took it apart, studied it, tried. One morning, he found her under the peach tree. Her palms were cupped around something tiny. A sparrow fledgling, too young to fly. Its wing bent at the wrong angle. "It won't make it," he said quietly. "We still try," she whispered. He didn't argue, because some things weren't about outcome. They were about effort. By late summer, the orchard bloomed heavier than any year prior. Tahuya tied her hair with twine, sleeves rolled high, humming as she picked fruit into baskets. Her voice was never loud, but it filled the air like something remembered after too long forgotten. Neighbors started to talk. A few came by, more curious than cruel. One man leaned over his saddle and said with a smirk, "Heard you married royalty." Elias didn't flinch. He just wiped his hands on his trousers and said, "No, I married someone who reminded me what it meant to breathe." That night, the rain came, soft and steady. Tahuya lit a lantern and set it in the window, the glass warm and glowing like a promise. "So you can always find your way back," she said, barely above a whisper. Elias stood by the door, watching her. He reached forward, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek, the way a man might brush dust from something sacred. "I ain't going anywhere," he said. She touched his face then, lightly, reverently, as if memorizing something already etched in her soul. "I know," she whispered. Outside, the earth drank deep. Inside, they stood close, not bound by vows nor by fear, but by the quiet, stubborn faith that some loves do not burn fast. They warm slow and last longer. Elias never asked her to stay, not with words. He didn't need to. She stayed because something in the soil had finally felt soft enough to root. Because the wind at his ranch didn't carry chains, only the smell of coffee and horses and mended fences. Some nights they still sat apart, he on the porch, pipe in hand. She by the hearth, weaving something with old leather scraps. But distance no longer meant division. It meant comfort, familiarity, the kind of silence people grow into after long winters and longer wars. And sometimes, just before sleep, she would murmur in the half-dark, "You listen better than any man I've known." He would chuckle low and say, "That's because I've run out of things to say." But they both knew that wasn't true. He had just learned that the most powerful words often came from hands, not mouths, from bringing her water before she asked, from watching her with reverence, not possession, from staying. Seasons passed, fields grew greener.
And when winter came again, she hung another lantern in the window, a second one. He asked her why. She smiled. So if I go looking for you, I'll find the way too. It wasn't a marriage, not by law or prayer, but in every nail hammered side by side, every mug of coffee poured without asking, every morning she didn't leave, something was being built, something holy, something whole. So if you ever find yourself riding the edge of someone else's sorrow, don't ride past. Don't look away just because she isn't crying out.
Because the ones who survive the fire often don't scream. They stand, they wait, and sometimes they are the very ones who will untie you, if you're brave enough to stop. Love doesn't always arrive loud. Sometimes it rides in quietly, like dusk over dry land. If this story stirred something in you, follow our Western Love Story series, tales of resilience, grace, and the kind of love that stays when the dust settles. Subscribe and ride with us. If you like this video, comment number 1. If you don't, comment number 2. Please subscribe to the channel to watch more videos and give me more motivation to collect and share other stories.